Hi, I'm Julian. I'm a lecturer in plant ecology and biogeography.
And I'm Connie. I'm an ecologist and digital creator.
We are interested in all sorts of ecological and evolutionary questions.
And that's why we founded EcolClips. Plant species beyond their native range fall into three categories: exotics, naturalized, and invasives. Exotics arrive in foreign environments, especially via horticulture and agriculture. Those that escape our gardens and can establish themselves are termed naturalized species, while invasives are those that harm their new environment by outcompeting natives for space and other resources. Seeking answers to why invasive plant species are so successful, we turn to Professor Dr. Leishman. Based at Macquarie University in Sydney, Michelle investigates the success of invasive plants and studies plant response to climate change in natural as well as urban environments. Michelle is also the director of Macquarie University's Centre for Green Cities, striving to find solutions for developing sustainable urban ecosystems.
There are more than 2,700 plant species invasive in Australia. What makes these species so successful and how do they outcompete natives for space and other resources?
So I'm going to correct you there, Julian. Not invasive in Australia, but naturalized, and there's a difference. So there's actually something like over 20,000 species, exotic species that have been introduced to Australia, so are exotic to Australia, which is more, so it's hard to get the numbers exactly, but we think that there are more exotic species in Australia now than native species, which is pretty incredible. So out of those 20,000, maybe 22,000, there's about that 2,700, that number that you gave me, they're what we call naturalized, which means that they're happy here, they've got self-sustaining populations, but they haven't actually invaded and become a problem. And then out of that, there's a couple of hundred, maybe 350, that are recognised as being invasive. So there's different ways that we label them. So they might be environmental weeds or agricultural weeds, but essentially they're the invaders. And then out of those, again, about 10% are what we call transformer species. And they're the big problematic ones that once they come into our native environments, they really impact biodiversity by smothering the vegetation or outcompeting and really transform the ecosystem dramatically. Exotic species have some advantages over native species. They might be freed of their pests and pathogens, so that gives them a natural competitive edge. Many of them don't actually outcompete, they just take advantage of the changed conditions. But we've often created environmental conditions that the exotic species really have the right adaptations for, and so they do super well in those environments. So sometimes it's about outcompeting, and sometimes it's just about taking advantage of changed environmental conditions. So there's a slight difference there. They don't always outcompete and smother. Sometimes they just fit in to the something new.
Climate is a major constraint for species distributions. Are exotic species more successful in areas that have similar climates to their native range?
So we use, it's kind of a rule of thumb that we use about climate suitability when we do risk assessments for when we're going to introduce species, maybe through the horticultural industry or through the agricultural industry. We do a risk assessment to go, are they low risk of becoming invasive and impacting our environment? And one of the key questions that we ask is about climate suitability. So we do a climate matching process. So that's kind of a rule of thumb in invasion biology, does the climate match? But it's not a perfect rule of thumb. So while obviously if you were going to introduce a species that was highly adapted to an alpine environment into a tropical location, it's probably not going to do super well. And in the same way that we've known for hundreds of years about coevolution, and we see that plants have particular adaptations to particular biomes. We know you go into an arid zone that the plants have particular characteristics. So climate's very important, but it's not 100% perfect. Because on the other hand, we also see when we introduce plants into new environments, and botanical gardens are a great example, often species do pretty well outside their climate envelope that they're used to in their native range. And that's because in the native range, it might be something else that's constraining their distribution, not necessarily all climate. So while climate's a good indicator of suitability of the habitat, it's not perfect, and we certainly know that there are some species, when you introduce them to a new climate, there's nothing like that in their native range, they still do pretty well. So it's a good indication, but it's not perfect by any means.
For those species that find themselves out of their native climate niche, climate envelopes, how do these species adapt to these new environments? And do you see very specific adaptations in the species already?
So sometimes they might be what we might call pre-adapted, right? So that in their native range, they're actually pretty tolerant of a wide range of conditions. And so we've introduced them to a slightly different environmental condition, but they're pretty good generalists. You know, they don't require specific pollinators, they don't require a specific seed disperser. They might be quite phenotypically plastic, for example. So they're the kind of, robust, tolerant, generalist type species. So we might call them pre-adapted, I guess, to slightly different conditions. But then we can also see evolutionary processes going on, and I think in the last perhaps 15 years or so, we've been surprised to see how much rapid evolution is actually going on. And so while we previously thought that evolution was particularly slow and we don't really see it operating, now that we are introducing species into all sorts of new environments, we see it playing out. So we see sometimes that's about hybridization with native species and you get a new super species. It happens rarely, but they can be very successful. And we also see evolution like a shift in towards different leaf size or a different height and other morphological characteristics. So we can see those patterns along environmental gradients, for example. So there's microevolution, there's hybridization, there's all sorts of different evolutionary processes going on in these new environments.
Michelle, in your opinion, what are the most pressing research questions in invasion biology today and for the future?
So I think we actually know quite a lot about invasion biology now. It's been going as a full discipline since the 1950s. And while we have a lot of very generalizable patterns, I think it's true to say that much of what we see is very context specific. So it's the combination of the traits of those plant species and the environment they're introduced to, and sometimes those windows of opportunity that have opened up the opportunity for them to become an invader. So actually, in many ways, I think invasion biology has come to perhaps a bit of a barrier that it's hard to be predictive. There's too much context specificity going on. But I think the places that we can really make advances are about the interactions of invasive species with other global change issues. So how does climate change impact invaders or the propensity for a species, the possibility for a species to become invasive? So what's the interaction between land use change and invasive species? So I think it's those places, really the interactions, where we will see the advances in knowledge.
And last question, what is your advice for early career researchers interested in invasion biology?
So I think invasion biology is actually a very cool area for anyone as a researcher, in that it includes that theoretical basis, so understanding evolutionary processes, understanding ecological processes. So it's got that very strong theoretical foundation, which is always satisfying in science, but it also has the practical applications. So I think it's a great opportunity for people to be working with government or industry or the range of stakeholders that are out there for invasion biology, which are very broad, to work in partnership to be able to solve those big problems. So for me, that's the satisfying component of it, is working in partnership and seeing the practical outcomes and the policy changes that come from the research that's undertaken.
Yeah, thank you very much.